Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into what is honestly one of the most mind-bending transformations in human history. We're going to trace a 300-year journey, how Western Europe literally rose from the ashes of the Roman Empire. We'll see exactly how absolute, total chaos gave way to a radically new, unified European empire.
To do this, we're going to break things down into 6 clear stages: the fall of Rome, the rise of the Franks, the Church gains power, the Carolingian dynasty, Charlemagne unites Europe, and finally, legacy of an emperor.
Part 1. The Fall of Rome.
Okay, so picture this. By the end of the 5th century, warring Germanic groups are violently pushing into the empire. The result? Total chaos. The massive infrastructure that held the entire continent together just completely vanished. Trade basically came to a screeching halt, traveling anywhere became incredibly deadly, and those grand ancient Roman cities, they were just abruptly abandoned. People literally fled the cities to survive, shifting back to a strictly rural way of life.
Now, this wasn't just a temporary setback. This total physical and societal collapse violently slammed the door on antiquity and ushered in a massive 1,000-year reality known as the Middle Ages, a period spanning roughly from the year 500 to 1500.
And you know, the physical collapse was just the beginning. It was immediately followed by a really profound cultural decay. Everyday folks became way less educated. Even Latin, the absolute bedrock of Roman communication, fractured completely. As these different Germanic groups settled down, their languages started blending with Latin phrases, and suddenly you have all these isolated dialects popping up. There was no longer a single language understood by everyone, which meant the continent became deeply, deeply disconnected.
Part 2. Rise of the Franks.
So, with central government completely out of the picture, what held people together? Family ties and loyalty to local tribal leaders became the new social glue. Out of this heavily fragmented landscape, a group called the Franks emerged as the real dominant force in Gaul, which is basically modern-day France. And the architect behind this whole expanding kingdom? A Germanic tribal leader named Clovis I. Now, in the year 496, Clovis pulls off an absolute masterstroke of geopolitical strategy. He and his warriors officially convert to Christianity. This was a huge deal. It wasn't just some personal spiritual awakening. It instantly secured the immense backing of the Pope in Rome. It basically gave the Franks this unparalleled edge in legitimacy over everyone else.
Part 3. The Church gains power.
While all these secular leaders are constantly fighting for control, the Church steps up to provide the only real sense of structural order in Europe. They set up these religious communities called monasteries, where people devoted their lives to worship and prayer. And honestly, these monasteries became absolutely crucial lifelines of learning. Inside those walls, monks were painstakingly copying and preserving the ancient writings of Rome, documents that, frankly, would have been permanently erased from history otherwise.
Then, a major shift happens in 590. Pope Gregory I radically expands the papacy. He basically transforms the Pope's role from being strictly a spiritual guardian into a formidable worldly power. We're talking secular politics. The Church literally started governing parts of Italy, raising armies, and negotiating treaties. Just like that, the spiritual and political realms were inextricably locked together.
Part 4. The Carolingian dynasty. Meanwhile, back in the Frankish kingdom, a legendary political lineage is quietly consolidating control. Power transitions incredibly smoothly down this family line, starting with Charles Martel in 719, passing to his son Pepin in 751, and finally landing with his grandson Charlemagne in 771. Let's give some context here. Charles Martel had already achieved absolute hero status in Europe by halting a massive Muslim military advance from Spain back in 732. He basically leveraged that immense prestige to lay the groundwork for his son, Pepin, to be officially crowned king in 751. That single event officially kicked off the Carolingian dynasty, perfectly setting the stage for one of Europe's most famous rulers.
Part 5. Charlemagne unites Europe.
And this brings us right to the ultimate culmination of our whole chaos to order story. By the year 800, Pepin's son, Charlemagne, had used his downright magnificent military skills to essentially reunite Western Europe. He forged this massive empire stretching across present-day France, Switzerland, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, and even parts of Austria and Spain. We are talking about a scale of unification completely unseen since the days of ancient Rome.
Now, how do you manage a territory that huge? Well, Charlemagne aggressively centralized his government by actively cutting the power of the local nobles. But the guy didn't just rule from afar, he tirelessly visited his people to personally judge cases. At the same time, he was a huge proponent of education, ordering monasteries to build schools. But without a doubt, his crowning achievement arrived in the year 800, when he was officially crowned emperor by Pope Leo III.
That coronation, profoundly historic. It symbolically locked together three massive continental forces. You had the raw Germanic military power, the spiritual and political authority of the Church, and the lingering, prestigious heritage of the Roman Empire. Suddenly, Europe had a cohesive identity again.
Part 6. Legacy of an Emperor. Charlemagne was deeply invested in this intellectual revival of his kingdom. He famously surrounded himself with brilliant English, German, and Spanish scholars to basically pull European culture back from the brink. So, looking back at everything we've discussed in this explainer, we really have to ask ourselves, what actually was his greatest achievement? Was it those unmatched military conquests that physically glued a broken continent back together? Or was it his relentless dedication to reviving education and administrative order out of the ashes of Rome?
Honestly, it's a debate historians still have today. Because even though Charlemagne's specific empire fell apart pretty shortly after his death, his reign completely redrew the map. He proved once and for all that Europe could be united again, and he laid the exact foundation for the modern European nations we recognize right now. Which leaves us with one final, kind of wild thought to chew on. If Charlemagne's massive, meticulously structured empire could just fall apart a generation after his death, what does it tell us about the permanence of the borders and nations we just completely take for granted?